Hello. Want to welcome you to the class. We are in the 39th chapter of Ezekiel, the 25th verse beginning. Thank you for your attendance this morning. Beautiful morning outside, a little cool, but it's a beautiful morning. We're just glad to be here and glad to have those that are in the auditorium present. We're glad to have some joining by live stream. Ezekiel 39:25 beginning. Ned, would you word a prayer for our class this morning, please? Amen. Well, last week we had a water leak or no water, and COVID has been playing games with us over the past several months, and so we're just glad to be assembled here this morning. Appreciate those that dealt with the water leak or the water leak between here and the road. A lot of work goes on behind the scenes in any congregation, and we just sometimes don't appreciate those who are involved in getting things up and running as far as the building is concerned. In the 39th chapter of Ezekiel, we'll review here the first 24 verses just briefly. The first 7 verses have to do with the destruction of the enemy. Now, Gog and Magog are kind of identified as the enemy. They put a name on the enemy of Israel, the enemy of God. Then in verses 8 through 16, God Ezekiel through God emphasizes that All right, are we coming through okay now? Does that sound good? Thank you, son. Sure, I save everything. Thank you. As I was saying, the last several verses of the chapter 39, have to do with the ultimate glory of God. Beginning and reading in verse 25, therefore, thus saith the Lord, saith the Lord God, now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob, and have mercy upon the whole house of Israel, and will be jealous or zealous for my holy name. Notice the emphasis there is on his holy name. And he was recognized when Israel returned to Jerusalem. He was recognized, of course, as being superior to the gods. He was recognized for his holiness, his mercy, not only by the Jews, but apparently by the nations around about. And then verse 26, and after that they have borne their shame. Those Jews that returned to Jerusalem should have been ashamed, and they were ashamed. And all their trespasses whereby they have trespassed against me when they dwelt safely in their land, and none of them being afraid. Verse 27, when I have brought them again from the people and gathered them out of their enemies' lands, and again I would emphasize that they had been there a number of years at the point of this prophecy, and no doubt many, if not most of them, had given up hope of ever getting back to their homeland. And of course, when it came time under Cyrus, the Persian king, to send them back to Jerusalem, a lot of them, of course, didn't go back. So in verse 27 again, when I have brought them again from the people and gathered them out of their enemies' lands, and am sanctified in them in the sight of many nations. So he would be recognized not only by the Jews, but in the world community, the known world community. Then in verse 28, then shall they know that I am the Lord, their God, which caused them to be led into captivity among the heathen. They're going to recognize that this wasn't just the Babylonians coming in and taking them away, and the Babylonians being superior, in military power or whatever, but they would recognize that God was punishing those folks, the Jews. But if I gathered them into their own land and have left none of them anymore there, well, none that wanted to come back. Obviously, many of them didn't come back. We know they didn't come back because under the Persian rule, when the Babylonian Empire gave way to Cyrus and Darius, the Persian rulers, and during the time of Esther, which was after this, where did we find Jewish settlements? The Persian Empire was divided up into 127, or either 127 or 129 provinces, and when the second ruler in the kingdom, when he decided to destroy the Jewish communities, Esther, interceded through the king. But there were Jewish settlements throughout Persia. So, we know they didn't all come back. And then, let me read 28 again. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, which caused them to be led into captivity, which caused them to be led into captivity among the heathen, but I have gathered them unto their own land, and have left none of them any more there. Neither will I hide my face any more from them, for I have poured out my Spirit upon the house of Israel, saith the Lord God. Now, that idea, neither will I hide my face any more from them, was that forever? Did that apply forever? It must not have applied forever. Why? Certainly God hid his face from the Jewish community in AD 70, the non-Christian Jewish community. But that last part of Ezekiel really identifies the ultimate glory of God as he once again began to nurture his people, the Jews, until, of course, the time of Christ, and when the Jews rejected Christ, and those that rejected him fell victim to the Roman assault in AD 70 when the city was obliterated. Now, that brings us to chapter 40, of course, and chapters 40, 41, 42, and 43 describe the temple, or describe a temple. Now, in this description, this is very tedious reading, and we're just going to give an overview of it, of these 4 chapters, 40, 41, 42, 43. And as we do an overview, it doesn't describe completely the Solomon temple. This language here doesn't describe the totality of the Solomon temple. And the restored temple was not nearly as, let's say, awesome as the description of the temple here. And then when Herod, restored the temple, I'm sure that it wasn't, Herod did that in the last century before Christ. Now, when you think about that, the temple description here is different than Solomon's temple a little bit. I'm sure it was different than Herod's restoration of the temple. So this temple that's being described here must have been something other than a physical building. Now, there are a lot of religious groups that look at these 4 chapters, and they kind of think this kind of supports their view of Christ returning and having 1,000-year rule, being on a physical throne in Jerusalem. I have a magazine here. I don't know who sent it to me. I get a lot of stuff that I don't order through the mail. And this magazine represents the international prophetic voice for the end times. Now, let me get that again. The international prophetic voice for the end times. And in this particular issue, there are at least 2 articles that describe what we call premillennialism, or dispensationalism, a large slice of the Christian, the broad Christian community, really believes that sometime Christ is going to come back and rule in Jerusalem. Now, before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about what this temple description is all about. First of all, in the first 27 verses of the 40th chapter, it describes the material regarding the outer court of the temple with various chambers and buildings. Well, then in chapter 40, beginning verse 27 or 28 to 47, it describes a gateway into the inner court with differing compartments and buildings. And again, this does not describe necessarily Solomon's temple, the original temple. And then chapters 48 to 41, 26 describes the temple itself. And then chapter 42, first 20 verses, describes additional buildings within the inner court with a number of dimensions relative to the whole. There were specific dimensions provided there in Ezekiel's language. And then chapters 43, first 12 verses there describe Jehovah's entry into God's entry into the house to abide there. And that's chapter 43, 1 to 12. And then the rest of chapter 43 has to do with the altar of burnt offerings in the inner court. Now, those people that we call dispensationalists or premillennialism people really sincerely believe that God is going to, or Jesus is going to return to sit on the throne in Jerusalem, in the landmass where Jerusalem now is located. They believe that there's going to be a restoration of the priesthood of the Levitical priesthood. They believe that the animal sacrifice is going to be restored. I suppose some of them have different, viewpoints on that. They believe that all the nations are going to be, really enthralled with all of this stuff where he is ruling from Jerusalem. It's really an interesting belief system. But as I said before, a large slice of Christendom really believes that that's going to be the case, where the law of Moses is going to be destroyed or is going to be reinstated. Now, let's have some discussion about, and I'll repeat the discussion so that we can, so those on live stream can hear it. Take that theory apart. Yeah. Kathy says, what would be the point of having, animal sacrifices? I mean, what was the purpose of Christ, dying on the cross if the animal sacrifices are going to be restored? I mean, what Kathy has a good point. How else would we take that theory apart? You'll run into some people that have this system of belief, so it would be good to have some response to it. What else? What else would we say to somebody that confronted us with that kind of a doctrine? Ken mentions that that this what would have been the purpose of Christ's sacrifice if we're going to go back to animal sacrifice under some kind of a new regime. What else? Say that again, Paula. Well, these folks wouldn't dismiss the idea of everlasting life, but they would say that this 1,000-year reign is just going to be a part of that. You see. Yeah. Well, that's we come back to that point. Tim, what do you think? Tim mentioned that they pull out a little passage in Revelation that they base a whole theory on. What's the Hebrew letter say about the blood of bulls and goats? What's the Hebrew letter say about the old covenant compared to the new covenant? let's turn to Hebrews. Well, you can find it. Hebrews the ninth chapter has something to say about that. Let's go to, and in fact, let's go to verse ninth chapter. Verse. Let's start with. Well, actually, let's just begin with the first verse. Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and worldly sanctuary. For there was a tabernacle made the first, wherein was the candlestick, and then it goes through and describes that the tabernacle. And then if we move down to verse 8 or verse 9, all of this was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did service perfect as pertaining to the conscience, which stood only in meats and drinks, and divers washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. Now, why would people want to go back to that sort of religious ritual? And he says, but then in verse 11, but Christ being come and high priest, of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building. Now, that the theory says, the Levitical priesthood is going to be restored. And then in verse 12, or verse 11, but Christ being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purged your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where a testament is, there must also be the necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is a force after the men are dead. Otherwise, it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. It's just a marvel to me that so many people buy into that doctrine. And as I indicated in the beginning of our class, that this magazine really it represents a whole segment of the so-called Christian community that believe this doctrine. Now, what did Paul say about some of these things? Let's go over to Colossians the 3rd chapter. And in that 3rd chapter, we see a clarification of some of these things. If you in the 3rd chapter, let's just begin reading there the first verse. If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Now, why would Christ return to have a physical throne in Jerusalem? You see, set your affections on things above, not on the things of the earth, and goes ahead and emphasizes that. Then, if we jump down to verse 11, where Paul was always confronted with those Jews, we called them Judaizing teachers. He was always confronted with those that wanted to restore part of the law. There was a conference in Jerusalem over this question of circumcision, right? In the New Testament, and that was because there were those who were teaching, you had to obey the law of Moses as well as the law of Christ. You see, Paul dispels that in verse 11 there in Colossians 3, when he says, "There's neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarians, Scythians, bond or free, nor free, but Christ is all and in all." Now, if there's no difference between Jews and Gentiles in the Christian community, and there isn't any difference, then what he's saying there is that he's not going to bind things, Jewish things on them. But the point there, let's ask what is the point here? The point is very definitely that who makes up Israel today? It's whether it's Jews, Gentiles, whatever. The church is comprised of, or Israel today is in fact, and we have plenty of evidence in that in the New Testament. Israel today is the Christian community, and so this description of the temple has nothing to do with something in the future that's going to be set up as a part of a throne of Jesus. You had your hand up, or?
Well, I just wanted to say that another good way to show that this theory is false is to be able to talk to people about the kingdom and the establishment of the kingdom, because they believe that kingdom of Christ is still to come. That when he came, he wanted to establish a kingdom, but he wasn't able to because people rejected him. So he started the church. Well, that's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that the church is the kingdom, and that we're not waiting on the kingdom to come, but that we are in the kingdom today. Colossians 1:13 and 14 tells us that. And so that's a very important idea. And it's sad that but it's not surprising because people missed it with Christ's first coming. There were a lot of people who rejected him and misunderstood his first coming. So it's not surprising that so many misunderstand his second coming.
Tim is saying that part of this belief system is that when Christ said that build his kingdom, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. They believe that that this whole matter of the church, the kingdom, really wasn't accomplished. Is that another way of saying it?
Well, yeah, remember they came preaching, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. But they say he didn't establish his kingdom.
Yeah.
Where the Bible teaches that he did.
If that theory were correct, what would that say about God?
That he wasn't powerful enough to establish, do what he wanted.
Yeah. You see the fallacy that they're saying that God's eternal plan couldn't be accomplished in the first century.
Well, and then too, if man could stop him the first time, why couldn't man stop him the second time?
Yeah. And Tim mentions that, if God was incapable because of the affairs of man, or the resistance of the devil, if he couldn't accomplish the kingdom the first time, then what makes one believe they could accomplish it the second time? The forces of evil, and this is a very important point. God said he would, and all through the last few chapters of Ezekiel, he's emphasizing that he's going to destroy the forces of evil, right? And to think that God couldn't bring that about in the first century essentially says that I don't really have a confidence in God.
Mark 9:1 says it will happen. There was people present that didn't see it, so it must be people a couple thousand years old. And Christ said, we're standing there to see it come in power.
Right. Ned's saying that Christ said that there'd be some there that would see the kingdom come to fruition, and his point was that there must be some pretty old people if the kingdom hasn't been established yet. Well, Romans, Paul in the Roman letter has some things to say about that, about this. Paul in the Ephesian letter Paul was all the time having to push back against these Judaizing teachers. These teachers that would say that you have to have you have to become subject to the law of Moses. Now, think about what Paul said about the efficacy of the new covenant compared to the old covenant, and then think about, wow, how could you believe that sort of thing? Well, so the folks that take this temple description literally, and those people that are dispensationalists, premillennial people, they of course look at these chapters and say, well, hey, here's proof. Solomon's temple didn't fit this description. The temple that was restored after the Jews came back from captivity, that doesn't fit it. Herod's temple doesn't fit the description, so there must be some kind of physical temple going to be built in the future. But of course, this temple language refers to the new covenant. The temple of the New Testament is what? What's the temple of the New Testament? Pardon me? The human being is the temple. Under under the Christian dispensation, who are the priests? Individual Christians are the priests. So you often wonder, how do people get caught up in these kinds of theories when it's very plain that Paul emphasized and Hebrews and all through the New Testament, they emphasize the superiority of the new covenant relative to the old covenant. They recognize the superiority of Christ over his sacrifice over the animal sacrifices. You see, how people get caught up there, I have no explanation. So let's look at the first few verses of chapter 40 in regard to this description of the temple here. In the 5th and 20th year of our captivity, now, how many years were they to be in captivity? 70. So here's he's dating this in the 5th and 20th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after that the city was smitten, in the selfsame day the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me thither. Ezekiel dates his prophecies regularly throughout the book. Now, Ezekiel had been taken into Jerusalem previously in a vision, and that previous vision was about what? What did God want to show? What did he want to show Ezekiel in a previous vision with regard to Jerusalem? He wanted to show the corruption that was inherent in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this time, he has in verse 2, in the visions of God brought he me into the land of Israel, set me upon a very high mountain, by which was as the frame of the city of the south, and brought me thither, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of brass, with a line of flax in his hand, and the measuring reed, and he stood in the gate. Now, here's the vision he had. And the man said unto me, Son of man, behold, with thine eyes behold with thine eyes, and hear with thine ears, and set thine heart upon all that I will show thee, for to the intent that I might show them unto thee art thou brought hither. Declare all that thou seest to the house of Israel. Now, this was a message that Ezekiel was to teach those captives that he was associated with. Then in verse 5, and behold, a wall. Now, here's some description of what he was seeing. And behold, a wall on the outside of the house, round about, and in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits long, by the cubit and by the hand breadth. And so he measured the breadth of the building 1 reed, and the height 1 reed. Now, we can see that in this description, in the beginning of this description of this temple, you can see how tedious this is going to be. Now, we're not going to go through this word by word because it has, well, it's good for reading. It's good and interesting reading. But we are practically done with these chapters at this point. What it would take, I think it would take a year of study at our rate of studying this, take a year of study to get through these 3 chapters, and then, although it's interesting stuff and God preserved it for us, but to what value would it be? Because he's really not describing a physical temple, but to try to decipher what each of these things mean in terms of the new covenant would take some scholarly discussions. So we will reference this next week. We'll just give a kind of a little review and then go on to the next section of Ezekiel. Well, thank you.